The injured bull refused to eat until he saw the man who once saved him. The storm had raged for hours, lashing the drought-hardened soil of the Blackwater Ranch with sheets of relentless rain. Jake Harmon pulled his slicker tighter around his lean frame and squinted through the downpour, the beam of his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness. The last of the herd had been accounted for, except for one pregnant heifer that had wandered off before the storm hit. He shouldn't be out here alone. His father would have called it foolish, would have insisted they wait until morning, but Samuel Harmon had been gone 8 months now, and the decisions, good or bad, fell squarely on Jake's shoulders. At 26, he was still learning to trust his instincts as the ranch's reluctant new owner. A flash of lightning illuminated the landscape, and Jake caught a glimpse of something in the shallow ravine below. He carefully made his way down the slippery embankment, his boots sinking ankle-deep in mud. When his flashlight found the heifer, Jake's heart sank. She lay motionless, her body already growing cold. The coyotes had found her first, wounded her badly, and the birth that followed had taken what strength she had left. Jake was about to turn back when a faint sound reached him above the drumming rain. Sweeping the flashlight across the ground, he found the source, a newborn calf, spindly-legged and trembling, half hidden behind its mother's body. The calf was alive, but in bad shape, its dark coat matted with blood from what appeared to be coyote wounds along its side. "Easy there, little one," Jake murmured, approaching slowly. The calf tried to stand, but collapsed immediately, too weak and injured to rise. Jake stripped off his slicker and gently wrapped the shivering animal, lifting it with effort. The climb back up the ravine was treacherous, his boots repeatedly losing purchase in the mud, but somehow he managed, the precious bundle held securely against his chest. By the time Jake reached the barn, both he and the calf were exhausted. He laid the animal on a bed of fresh straw and examined the injuries under the bright overhead lights. 3 deep gashes ran along the calf's right flank, and its breathing was shallow, labored. Jake spent the night in the barn, cleaning the wounds, administering antibiotics, and feeding the orphaned calf formula from a bottle. When dawn broke, he called Doc Whelan, the local veterinarian who'd been treating the Harmon cattle since before Jake was born. The old vet arrived within the hour, his weathered face grim as he examined the calf. "Doesn't look good, Jake," he said finally, straightening with a wince that spoke of his own aging bones. "The wounds are deep, probably infected already, and even if he survives that, he's weak from blood loss and trauma. Most sensible thing would be to put him down now, save him the suffering." Jake looked down at the calf, meeting its dark eyes. Something in that gaze, a stubborn spark of life despite everything, made the decision for him. "I want to try," he said quietly. Doc Whelan studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Your call. I'll leave you antibiotics and pain meds. He'll need round-the-clock care for at least a week. And Jake..." He placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder. "Don't get too attached. The odds aren't in his favor." But Jake was already attached, though he wouldn't have admitted it aloud. Something about this calf's fight to survive resonated with his own struggle to keep the ranch afloat after his father's death had left him with a mortgage he could barely manage and a responsibility he hadn't asked for. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of exhaustion. Jake moved a cot into the barn, waking every few hours to tend to the calf he'd started calling Warrior. He cleaned the wounds daily, coaxing the reluctant animal to take the bottle, and eventually helping him stand on wobbling legs. Against the odds, Warrior began to improve. The wounds slowly healed, leaving scars that would forever mark his side but no longer threatened his life. He graduated from bottle to bucket, his appetite growing along with his strength. And most surprising to Jake was the connection that formed between them. The way Warrior would turn at the sound of his voice, following Jake with his eyes and eventually trailing after him around the barn like an oversized puppy. "You're determined to make a liar out of Doc Whelan, aren't you?" Jake said one morning 6 weeks after the rescue, as Warrior butted his head playfully against his leg. By the time summer arrived, Warrior had grown into a sturdy young bull calf, the early trauma evident only in the scars on his flank and an unusual wariness around strange noises. He responded to Jake's whistled commands with an intelligence that even neighboring ranchers commented on, and maintained a gentleness that belied his increasingly powerful frame. "Never seen anything like it," Whelan said during one of his visits to discuss a potential hay deal. "Bull like that should be getting ornery by now, but he follows you around like a dog." Jake merely shrugged, unwilling to examine too closely the bond that had formed. Warrior had become more than livestock. He was a companion during the lonely work of keeping the ranch running, a living reminder that sometimes beating the odds was possible. But reality had a way of intruding on even the most meaningful connections. The bank's latest notice had arrived that morning, the politely worded letter making clear that Jake was running out of time to make the mortgage payments. 3 bad years in a row, drought, followed by his father's unexpected death, followed by cattle prices dropping just when he needed to sell, had left the Blackwater Ranch hanging by a thread. That evening, as Jake sat on the fence watching Warrior graze in the pasture, his neighbor Seth Parker pulled up in his dusty truck. Seth ran the county's largest ranch, a modern operation with technology and resources Jake could only dream of. He'd been making offers on the Blackwater property for years, even before Samuel's death. "Came to talk about that bull of yours," Seth said without preamble after climbing out of his truck, the one with the scars. "My nephew Ryan saw him when he was helping you mend fences last week. Says he's something special." Jake's guard went up immediately. "He's not for sale." "Everything's for sale for the right price, son," Seth replied easily. "Word is you're behind on payments. I know a guy who supplies bulls for the rodeo circuit. He'd pay top dollar for an animal with that build and temperament, enough to clear your debts, maybe even keep this place running another year." Jake wanted to refuse outright, but the bank's letter burned in his pocket. The truth was, he was running out of options. Selling Warrior might buy him enough time to turn things around, to keep his father's legacy from slipping away completely. "I need to think about it," he said finally. Seth nodded, clearly sensing victory. "Offer stands for a week. After that, my friend moves on to the Montana circuit." After Seth left, Jake stayed on the fence until dusk fell, watching Warrior in the fading light. The bull sensed his troubled mood, approaching to rest his massive head against Jake's leg in a gesture that had become familiar over the months. "What am I supposed to do?" Jake asked quietly, rubbing the spot between Warrior's ears that always made the bull's eyes half close in contentment. "Let this whole place go under. Sell to Parker and watch him turn it into another factory farm." Warrior offered no answers, only the steady warmth of his presence. 3 days later, Jake made the call. Seth's Rodeo connection arrived the following morning with a trailer and a check that would keep the bank at bay for at least 6 months. The man was professional, experienced in handling bulls, but Jake insisted on leading Warrior to the trailer himself. It should have been a simple loading, but something in Warrior sensed what was happening. The bull planted his feet at the trailer ramp, refusing to move forward. When the handler moved to prod him with a stock pole, Jake intervened. "Give me a minute with him." The man shrugged, stepping back. Jake moved to Warrior's side, speaking low in his ear, as he had countless times during the long nights of the bull's recovery. "I don't have a choice, buddy. I wish I did." He swallowed hard against the tightness in his throat. "You're going to be okay. You're strong now. A survivor." Whether it was the familiar voice or simple exhaustion from resistance, Warrior finally allowed himself to be led up the ramp and into the trailer. The last Jake saw of him was his dark eyes, watching through the slats as the trailer pulled away, raising dust that mingled with the unseasonal rain that had begun to fall. That night, alone in the too-quiet barn, Jake pulled out his father's bottle of whiskey and broke the seal he'd preserved since the funeral. As the liquor burned down his throat, he tried to convince himself he'd made the only sensible choice. Warrior was just livestock, after all, not family, not a friend. But in the morning, when he instinctively whistled for the bull during his chores, only to be met with silence, the hollow feeling in his chest told a different truth. He had saved Warrior once, given him a chance at life when others would have chosen the merciful end. Now he could only hope that somewhere on the rodeo circuit, that same fighting spirit would see the bull through whatever challenges lay ahead. What Jake couldn't know then, as he forced himself back into the rhythm of ranch life without his unlikely companion, was that life has a way of coming full circle, that some bonds once formed cannot be permanently severed by distance or time, and that sometimes the one you saved might someday return the favor in ways you never imagined possible. 5 years passed, seasons turning in their relentless cycle over the Blackwater Ranch. Jake had managed to hold on to the property, though just barely. The money from selling Warrior had bought him time, and a lucky break with cattle prices the following year had kept the bank satisfied, if not entirely at bay. He'd scaled back operations, doing most of the work himself and hiring day labor only when absolutely necessary. It wasn't the thriving operation his father had built, but it was surviving. The Blackwater County Rodeo came every summer, a tradition Jake had attended since childhood. This year, he almost skipped it. There was fencing that needed repair, and a leaky roof on the barn that wouldn't fix itself. But Marissa Evans, the new veterinarian who had taken over Doc Whelan's practice after his retirement, had been subtly hinting for weeks that she wouldn't mind going with him. After 5 years of putting the ranch before everything else in his life, Jake decided one evening of distraction wouldn't bring everything crashing down. The fairgrounds buzzed with the familiar energy of small-town celebration. Jake and Marissa found seats halfway up the bleachers with a good view of the arena. He made polite conversation, tried to focus on her animated descriptions of life in the city before she'd moved to Blackwater. But his attention kept drifting to the activity around the chutes, where the next events were being prepared. And then I told my professor that his entire theory about equine respiratory infections was completely backward, which is why I had to change majors and flee the country, Marissa said suddenly. Jake blinked, turning back to her. Sorry, what? She laughed, not unkindly. Just checking if you were listening. You've been 1,000,000 miles away since we sat down. Sorry, he said with genuine regret. It's not the company, just a lot on my mind. The announcer's voice boomed over the loudspeaker, introducing the bull riding event. Jake settled back, determined to be better company. The first few riders were thrown quickly, none managing to stay the required 8 seconds on their assigned bulls. The crowd's enthusiasm never wavered, each attempt met with cheers and collective gasps when riders hit the dirt. Next up, ladies and gentlemen, the announcer called, is Tyson Miller on Scarred Warrior, the meanest bull on the circuit. This bull has thrown every rider for the past 3 seasons. Will tonight be different? Jake froze at the name, an impossible suspicion forming. As the chute opened and the bull exploded into the arena, time seemed to slow. The animal was massive now, at least 2,000 pounds of pure muscle and fury, but the distinctive pattern of scars along his right flank was unmistakable. Warrior. The bull twisted and bucked with terrifying power, his rider clinging desperately before being thrown high and landing hard. As the rodeo clowns distracted Warrior so the rider could escape the arena, Jake watched the bull's movements with a knot in his stomach. Behind the rage and power was something else, a frantic quality, an animal pushed to the edge. Jake, you okay? Marissa's concerned voice barely registered. He stood abruptly. I need to see someone. I'll be right back. Jake made his way down the bleachers and around to the stock pens where the rodeo animals were kept. It took some convincing, but his status as a local rancher eventually got him past security to where the bulls were cooling down after their performances. Warrior was in the last pen, separated from the other bulls. Up close, Jake could see the changes 5 years had wrought. The playful calf had grown into an imposing bull, his dark hide now marked with additional scars beyond the original coyote wounds. He paced the confines of his pen with agitated energy, steam rising from his powerful body in the cool evening air. "Impressive animal, isn't he?" a voice said behind Jake. A man in a Rodeo company shirt approached the fence. The name tag identified him as Mike Rawlins, stock contractor. Nobody gets near him except the handlers, and even they keep their distance when they can. Most aggressive bull I've ever worked with. "He wasn't always that way," Jake said quietly. Rawlins looked at him with newfound interest. "You know this bull. I raised him. From a calf. His name was Warrior." "No kidding." The contractor studied Jake with skepticism. Well, whatever he was before, he's a demon now. Best bull on the circuit for throwing riders, but he's becoming a liability, too unpredictable. Something in the man's tone made Jake uneasy. "What do you mean?" Rawlins hesitated, then apparently decided there was no harm in elaborating. "Took a bad fall last event in Casper. Injured his shoulder. Vet says he'll recover, but the owner's considering cutting his losses. Bull like that, with his reputation, once he's injured." He looked away, his meaning clear. Jake felt sick. The bull that had once followed him like a shadow, that had survived against all odds as a calf, was now facing a death sentence for no reason beyond cold economics. "Is he for sale?" The question left his mouth before he could consider its implications. Rawlins laughed. "Everything's for sale for the right price, but why would you want him? Can't be bred, too dangerous to keep around as a pet." The echo of Seth Parker's words from 5 years ago. "Everything's for sale for the right price," rang in Jake's ears. He found himself making calculations, mentally tallying his meager savings and the credit line he still had available. "Tell the owner I'm interested," Jake said firmly. "Here's my number. I'll be waiting for his call." 3 days later, after tense negotiations and a bank visit that left him with a loan he could ill afford, Jake backed his trailer up to the Rodeo company's loading chute. Warrior was sedated for transport, a precaution the handlers insisted upon. Even in his drugged state, the bull radiated danger, his massive body tense with barely contained aggression. "You're crazy, man," one of the handlers said as they closed the trailer. "That bull's got killing on his mind." 5 years of rodeo broke something in him. Jake said nothing, focusing on securing the trailer gate. He couldn't explain the compulsion that had driven him to this moment, the certainty that he couldn't walk away a second time. Logic argued against everything he was doing. The ranch needed money, not another mouth to feed, especially not one attached to a ton of angry, injured bull. But the debt he felt toward Warrior outweighed practical concerns. The drive back to Blackwater Ranch was tense, the trailer shuddering occasionally as its occupant shifted despite the sedation. Jake kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the trailer walls burst apart. By the time he pulled up to the reinforced corral he'd hastily prepared, his shirt was soaked with nervous sweat. Unloading proved as challenging as expected. The sedation was wearing off, and Warrior emerged from the trailer with his head lowered, pawing aggressively at the ground. Jake maintained a safe distance, using the corral's design to guide the bull into the enclosure without direct interaction. When the gate finally closed between them, he exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. Marissa arrived shortly after D, having agreed to examine the bull, despite her reservations about Jake's impulsive purchase. "You know this is insane, right?" she said, observing Warrior from a safe distance. "That bull is famous for being unmanageable. What are you planning to do with him?" Jake had no good answer. The impulse that had driven him to buy back Warrior hadn't extended to practical considerations about what would come next. "Give him a chance to heal. After that, we'll see." Marissa's examination, conducted with extreme caution, and the corral bars between her and her patient, confirmed what the rodeo vet had diagnosed: a shoulder injury that would heal with time and rest, but would likely end Warrior's rodeo career regardless. Physically, he'll recover, she concluded. But Jake, I have to be honest, I've never seen a bull this aggressive outside of a fighting breed. Whatever happened to him in those rodeo years changed him completely. He may never be safe to handle. Jake nodded, accepting her assessment while stubbornly holding on to the hope that somewhere inside the aggressive animal was the calf he had raised. The first week seemed to confirm Marissa's pessimism. Warrior refused food, knocking over the water trough, and charging the corral fence whenever Jake approached. The once special connection between them appeared completely severed, replaced by a wall of animal rage and fear. He's not eating at all, Marissa asked during her follow-up visit, concern evident in her voice. Nothing, Jake confirmed. I've tried different feeds, even supplements. He just knocks it all over. That's not good. The injury needs nutrition to heal, and a bull his size can't go without food much longer before it affects his health. She hesitated, then added gently, Jake, if he's refusing to eat, it might be that he's given up. Some animals do that when the stress becomes too much. He survived worse as a calf, Jake insisted. He's a fighter. That was different. He was young, adaptable, and he had you. Now he's been through years of rodeo life, constant transportation, electric prods, unfamiliar handlers. That changes an animal. Jake couldn't argue with her assessment, but neither could he accept it. Each day, he spent hours sitting just outside the corral, talking to Warrior in the same low, steady voice he had used years ago when cleaning the calf's wounds. The bull alternated between ignoring him completely and making threatening displays. But Jake persisted. I know you're in there somewhere, buddy, he said one evening, 2 weeks after bringing Warrior home. The same fighter who wouldn't give up as a calf. I'm not giving up on you now. Warrior stood at the far end of the corral, his massive frame silhouetted against the sunset, as distant and unreachable as the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Jake rested his forehead against the corral bars, exhaustion and doubt finally catching up with him. I'm sorry, he whispered, the words meant for himself as much as for the bull. I never should have let you go. The moment everything changed came unexpectedly, nearly 3 weeks after Warrior's return to Blackwater Ranch. Jake had settled into a routine of sitting by the corral each evening as the sun set, sometimes reading aloud from the ranch ledger or old newspapers, sometimes simply existing in companionable silence with a bull that wanted nothing to do with him. The untouched feed buckets were removed and replaced daily, a ritual that felt increasingly hopeless, but one Jake couldn't bring himself to abandon. That particular evening was spectacularly golden, the setting sun painting the landscape in amber light that seemed to make the very air glow. Jake had been working since dawn, mending fences in the north pasture, and his body ached with the particular exhaustion that comes from physical labor under an unforgiving sky. He slumped against the corral post, his hat pushed back, too tired even to speak. Warrior stood in his usual spot at the far end of the enclosure, his dark form imposing even at a distance. Jake watched through half-closed eyes as the bull suddenly raised his head, nostrils flaring as if catching an unfamiliar scent. Then, slowly, with a deliberateness that seemed almost ceremonial, Warrior began to walk toward him. Jake held perfectly still, instinct warning him against any movement that might break whatever spell had prompted this unprecedented approach. The bull stopped several yards away, close enough that Jake could see the flecks of gold reflected in his dark eyes. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other, man and animal, connected by nothing more than shared light and space. Then Warrior lowered his massive head, sniffing the air between them. Jake remained motionless, hardly daring to breathe. When the bull took another step forward, a strange sound emerged from his throat, not the threatening rumble Jake had grown accustomed to, but something softer, inquisitive. It reminded Jake of the noise Warrior had made as a calf, when uncertain but curious. "Hey there, buddy," Jake whispered, his voice cracking slightly. At the sound, Warrior's ears flicked forward, his head tilting in a gesture so familiar it made Jake's chest ache. Recognition. There was no other word for what passed through the bull's eyes in that moment. Warrior took another step forward, then another, until he stood directly on the other side of the corral fence. With excruciating slowness, Jake raised his hand, palm flat, and extended it through the bars. Everything in him screamed that this was dangerous, foolhardy. This was not the gentle calf he had raised, but a powerful, traumatized animal, perfectly capable of maiming or killing him with minimal effort. Yet some deeper instinct, the same one that had compelled him to rescue a dying calf and buy back a dangerous bull, guided his movements. Warrior's breath was warm against his palm, the sensation achingly familiar despite the years between. For several heartbeats, there was only that shared breath. Then, impossibly, the bull leaned forward, pressing his forehead against Jake's outstretched hand. "There you are," Jake whispered, tears blurring his vision. "I knew you were still in there." The transformation wasn't instantaneous or complete. Warrior didn't suddenly revert to the docile animal of Jake's memory. But when Jake placed a fresh bucket of feed near the fence that evening, the bull approached and ate for the first time since his return. It was a beginning. Days became weeks, and gradually a new routine emerged. Warrior remained cautious, occasionally retreating into defensive behavior when startled, but the violent aggression that had characterized his early days back at the ranch subsided. He began to accept Jake's presence, then seek it out, standing at the fence when Jake appeared as if waiting for him. "Never seen anything like it," Marissa marveled during a follow-up examination, safely conducted with Warrior secured in the squeeze chute, but notably calmer than during her first visit. His physical recovery is remarkable, but the behavioral change is even more surprising. It's like he's remembered who he was, who he is. Jake corrected gently. He just needed time to find it again. A month after Warrior's breakthrough, Jake was replacing a rotted fence post when a car he didn't recognize pulled up the drive. A woman emerged, professional-looking, with a camera hanging around her neck. "Jake Harmon." She called, approaching with a friendly wave. "I'm Sarah Collins from the Blackwater Gazette. I was hoping to talk to you about your bull." Jake frowned, setting down his tools. "How did you hear about that?" "Marissa Evans mentioned it when I was doing a piece on her veterinary practice," Sarah explained. "Said it was the most remarkable animal rehabilitation case she'd ever seen. A rodeo bull that refused to eat until he recognized the rancher who raised him. That's a story our readers would love." Jake's instinct was to refuse. His relationship with Warrior felt private, almost sacred. But the practical side of him, the side that still worried about mortgage payments and the ranch's future, recognized an opportunity. "What would this involve?" he asked cautiously. "Just an interview, some photos of you and the bull." "Nothing intrusive," Sarah assured him. The resulting article, published the following Sunday, was tasteful and surprisingly moving. Sarah had captured the essence of Jake and Warrior's connection without resorting to sentimentality or sensationalism. The accompanying photos, Jake standing by the fence, Warrior approaching him with evident trust, conveyed more than words could have about the bond between them. What Jake hadn't anticipated was the response. The story was picked up by regional papers, then shared across social media platforms. By the end of the week, the ranch's rarely used phone was ringing constantly with interview requests and, more surprisingly, offers of support. A feed company wanted to donate supplies. A local contractor volunteered to repair the barn roof. Visitors began appearing at the gate, hoping to see the famous bull and the rancher who had saved him twice. "You could turn this into something," Marissa suggested one evening as they sat on Jake's porch, watching Warrior in the corral that had been expanded to give him more space. "People are clearly moved by your story." "It's not my story," Jake protested. "It's just something that happened. Something remarkable," Marissa insisted. "And it's happening at a time when people need to believe in second chances, in healing." She hesitated, then added, "You've always said the ranch needs to diversify to survive. Maybe this is your opportunity." The idea took root slowly. Jake had never envisioned Blackwater as anything but a working cattle ranch, the same operation his father and grandfather had run. But as summer faded into fall, he found himself making changes almost without consciously deciding to. The visitors kept coming, so he established viewing areas where people could safely observe Warrior. When a retired couple offered a generous donation, suggesting he might consider taking in other rodeo animals that needed rehabilitation, the seed of a larger vision began to grow. A year to the day after Warrior had first recognized him in the sunset light, Jake stood on his porch, surveying a very different Blackwater ranch. The original cattle operation continued on a smaller scale, but a significant portion of the property had been converted into what was now officially the Blackwater Animal Sanctuary. 4 more former rodeo bulls had joined Warrior, along with 3 retired broncos and a roping horse with a damaged leg. Each had their own story of trauma and recovery, though none quite matched the special connection between Jake and the sanctuary's first resident. The donations and modest visitor fees had stabilized the ranch's finances, in a way Jake's struggle with traditional ranching never had. More importantly, the work fulfilled something in him that he hadn't realized was missing. A purpose that honored both his family's legacy and his own compassionate nature. Quite a change from the desperate rancher who could barely make his mortgage payments, Marissa observed, joining him on the porch. Her visits had become increasingly personal over the months, the professional relationship evolving into something neither of them had yet defined, but both valued deeply. "Never would have happened without you," Jake pointed out. "You're the one who convinced me to go to that rodeo in the first place. And you're the one who recognized a bull you hadn't seen in 5 years, then mortgaged everything to buy him back," she countered. "Not exactly a sensible business decision at the time." Best bad decision I ever made," Jake smiled, his gaze drifting to where Warrior grazed peacefully in the evening light. The bull lifted his head as if sensing Jake's attention, the gesture so reminiscent of their earliest days together that Jake felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not pain anymore, but a fullness that had no name. As the sun sank toward the horizon, casting the landscape in the same golden light that had witnessed their reconnection, Jake descended the porch steps and walked to the fence. Warrior approached immediately, no hesitation now in his powerful stride. The days when the bull refused food, when he charged the fence in fear and rage, seemed to belong to another lifetime. Jake reached through the bars, resting his hand on the bull's broad forehead in what had become their customary greeting. Warrior leaned into the touch, his dark eyes reflecting the sunset gold. "Who would have thought," Jake murmured, "that saving you would end up saving everything else?" Warrior made a low sound in his throat, a rumble that Jake had learned to interpret as contentment. Behind them, the sanctuary buildings glowed in the fading light. The renovated barn, the new recovery paddocks, the modest visitor center. Beyond those, the original ranch house stood as it had for 3 generations, anchoring the past to this unexpected present. There was poetry in it, Jake thought, how a desperate act of compassion on a stormy night could ripple outward through time, touching so many lives beyond his own. How the injured calf he had refused to give up on had grown into the catalyst for transformation, his own journey from brokenness to healing, somehow healing Jake in return. In the soft golden hour, as shadows lengthened across the land his family had worked for generations, Jake stood with his hand resting on Warrior's massive head and allowed himself to fully feel the rightness of where they had arrived. Not the path either of them would have chosen, perhaps, but one that had led them exactly where they needed to be. The injured bull who had refused to eat until he saw the man who once saved him had, in his own way, returned the favor 1,000 times over. And in the symmetry of their shared journey, from rescue to separation to reunion to renewal, there was a completeness that required no words. Only the quiet acknowledgement between two beings who had found their way back to each other against all odds, and in doing so had found their way forward.